Welcome everybody to another sprint demo from the Evernym team that contributes Upstream to Hyperledger and Sovrin projects. Today, we've got a few things to show. During 2019, we've been able to roll out a lot of really nice new features to Hyperledger Indy. And we really culminated that with reworking the view change process in October. And the last month and a half, we've been more focused on bug fixing, performance, and stability. And so that's what we are going to show today. On the SDK side, we had a major initiative in November, second half October, November, to add support to libvcx for the Aries protocols. So we can have real world interoperability with other Aries agents like Akapi and StreetCred's agent, and Matter's agent, Matter Global. And that project went really well. We didn't quite finish at the start of December like we wanted to, and so we've been finishing that up. We also spent some time, we evaluated the Aries Framework Go. It was interesting to see the approach they took to Aries agents. We'd like to discuss that during an Aries call, probably in January. We did some bug fixing as well. So those are the main things we did. Now, one other thing that has been a major focus. The Sovrin Foundation has officially approved Sovrin Governance Framework version 2, and it's going through steward approval, and part of that is a transaction author agreement, an agreement that protects stewards when they are hosting on the network, that authors can't argue with them about data integrity, as well as in certain jurisdictions, the ability to remove data from an indelible ledger would be awkward. So we want to make sure transaction authors are aware that there's certain rights or certain responsibilities they have when they interact with the ledger, and that working with an indelible ledger also has certain characteristics that they can't remove their data. And so that's the transaction author agreement. Yeah, that is ready to be enforced. The expectation is for it to be enforced on Sovrin StagingNet in January and Sovrin Mainnet in February. It's already on BuilderNet functionally. They'll put the exact agreement on. And as we've been preparing for that enforcement, we got a lot of feedback on how that transaction author agreement works in practice. And so that is another major initiative we'll be discussing today, is how we've changed the way the transaction author agreement interacts on the ledger. It doesn't actually change much for the initial rollout, but whenever there's a new agreement in 6 months or a year or however long it takes, we change quite a bit the way that process will go from moving from one version of the agreement to the next version of the agreement. And that was based on feedback. We made a couple minor changes for the rollout. One thing that we used to say, if you signed an agreement and there wasn't one on the ledger, that we would reject your transactions. And we say, well, that doesn't really matter. The ledger doesn't care if you sign an agreement that doesn't matter to the ledger. So it's a lot nicer if we accept those transactions, because then your software can start accepting the agreement in advance of it actually being enforced on the ledger without things being rejected. And that'll give you a nice transition to when enforcement starts in January. So that's part of this release, which means it should get on the ledger in January before enforcement starts. We'll talk about a few other changes we made as we go through the demo today. So those are the main topics. So we're going to start with Renata. She's going to take us through the documentation for the view change work we did. Then we're going to talk about a bug fix to the way that the cred defs are handled. We had a request from our colleagues in the government of Alberta to make sure we can handle empty credentials correctly, so we've tested that. And then we'll go into more detail around how the transaction author agreement works. We'll come back to that topic. So make sure Alex didn't make any substantive changes to the schedule. I had it loaded before he made his edits. Okay, everything's the same. So I will stop sharing my screen. And go ahead, Renata.
Hello, let me share my screen. Yes. Can you see my screen? No. In the sprint, we added documentation for a new change logic. Compared to the previous view change mechanism, the new one doesn't contain a catch-up. This makes it much faster, and it takes no more than 30 seconds, usually only a few seconds. The new change has stages of sending view change messages, answering them, and sending new view messages from the next primary node. Features and additional mechanisms are also reflected in the diagram. You can see them later in details. In addition, we added latest changes in documentation, updated for catch-up, audit ledger, and message requests. We updated the description of the audit ledger processes in accordance with the change in the method of selecting a new primary node. And we updated information about view change that it's have been removed from the catch-up diagram. If you saw it before. So in the end of catch-up, we now have no view change, or have no the option when we do a catch-up in view change. And a description of requesting a new view and view change messages for a new view change have been added to the description of that. Sorry, description of requesting new view and view change messages were added to the file with message requests mechanism, and that there. So you can find all documentation in the docs directory in Plenum. Thank you. Have any question?
That's excellent. That's really useful. If anybody has questions about how the view change process works, that documentation is the best place to start. You can also look at the history of demos we put into this channel. Anything by Renata or Sergey K or Andrew or Alex over the last 6 months, there's a lot of detail on view change. It'll really help people to follow along what's been how this key part of consensus works. So thank you, Renata. I think that'll be really useful. Oh, and I'll add links in the description of the video for anybody who has trouble finding the documents. Thank you for that. Alex?
Hello. I'm going to tell you about one fix that we did last sprint. Actually, the fix was done by Nem, but he's on PTO. But I think that this is quite important change that affects a lot of users of Indy and Sovrin network, so it's worth presenting this on the demo. So this issue was reported by the community, and there was an issue reproduced against the data transactions stored on the Sovrin mainnet. There was a quite large schema with more than 100 attributes, and it was successfully written to the mainnet, and it was possible to query this schema. Then they created a credential definition corresponding to this schema, which was also successfully written to the mainnet. And once they tried to query this credential definition, it failed with timeout. So it looked, well, really weird, because write was successful, but the get was not. And by the way, get credential definition was working for other credential definitions which are created for not so huge schemas. So that Yeah.
And what's the limit we expect to how big a schema can be?
The limit for schema is 125 attributes.
Okay.
So it was under this limit. Well, otherwise the transaction would be just rejected because we have this kind of static validation. So what was the issue reason? Actually, it was the main suspicion from the very beginning was that it's somehow related to the validation that we are doing against the maximum size of the messages. And this validation is done against all the messages, both inbound and outbound, between any node-to-node, client-to-node, or node-to-client communication. And the current limit is 128 kilobytes. So, as you mentioned, we have a limit, exactly because of these reasons, we have a limit for the maximum number of attributes a single schema might contain, and this is was chosen as 125, and it's not a random number. It was chosen taking into account the size of the corresponding credential definition so that it fits into this limit. So it was really weird initially why, well, the credential definition looks correct, so it's under the limit, so why a GET request didn't work. But the main reason why GET request didn't work in this case, because reply for GET, for read requests, it contains more than just the payload as in write transaction. So the payload itself, it was under the limit, because there is less than 125 attributes in the schema. But any read replies, they also contain some metadata, including state proofs and BLS signatures. Moreover, the value itself, which is pretty huge here, it's almost close to this limit. This value itself, it's also part of the state proof. So it means that a GET reply was kind of twice more than just a payload of credential definition. So the reply for this request was more than the limit of 128 kilobytes. So what was the fix? The fix was quite simple. We decided that it's safe just to get rid of this maximum size validation for outbound messages. And why it's okay to remove it? Because this validation itself doesn't mean that the clients should not care about the size of the messages, size of replies that the node can transmit, because the node can be malicious and they can send intentionally gigabytes of data to clients. So clients should not rely on this check at all. So for clients, it doesn't matter whether it's checked there or not. As for the node side, we still have a maximum size validation for input for inbound messages for both node-to-node and client-to-node communication. So huge messages from the client or from other nodes still will be rejected. And if a node is correct, then it should not produce huge replies to GET, since the payload itself is already validated that it's not huge. As we have seen before, it's really hard to predict the exact size of state proof and additional metadata in replies. But since we already have a limit for the payload part, this metadata should not be huge. It's definitely restricted. So that's the reasons why it's okay to remove this validation. So there is a number of tests checking that everything works now. So in particular, this test, which creates a schema, a huge schema, with a number of attributes equal to the limit, 125, and each attribute is also equal to limit. Well, GET request of credential definition works successfully in this case. Didn't work before the fix. That's all. And yes, this fix will be part of the next December release.
That's excellent. It's useful to understand the best practices around large credentials. I know that that topic's coming up more and more frequently, so that's really instructive. Thank you, Alex. And Nikita?
So let me share my screen. So we had a request from, I don't know from who exactly, I think it was BCGov, that they need to use empty credentials. Because is one way when to make a credential with an empty field, we just use empty string as a signification of an empty value, and we found out that it just works. So what we have done, we have made some tests that prove that it really works. We have made some examples and updated the documentation. So to create a credential with an empty value, you just need to when you are passing credential values, you just need to pass value as empty, and encoded value should not be empty string. We have mentioned it in the documentation. Also, we have checked and made it in the demo that we can check that some parameter or attribute in credential is empty. So this check also works, and it's checked in our demo. And here we can see like the example of a credential that has an empty value. So also we have checked the VCX part, and here we also added a mention about of. Wait a second. Also here we added a mention here. I can find it in V6 straight away. So we here had a mention that we can use empty values as a values of an attribute. Yeah. So here's the example of this such usage. So that's it. That's what we have done for this issue.
That's excellent. We not the engineers, but on the product team and customer success, we were nervous it didn't work because we recognized that if you have no value, then it's really hard to encrypt that value or do the anon cred, generate the credential. But you can see that the encoding is handling that correctly. The customer who's seeing the problem was using Evernym products. So the next step, we still need to validate that it works with the next layer of the stack. So this is great for people who are using libvcx and Indy to know that this is possible. And I have seen a lot of conversation on Rocket Chat around, how do you do this? How do you do optional credentials, empty credentials, things like that? So it does work in the core libraries. So that should benefit everybody. And then we're going to validate, make sure it works in the entire stack. So thank you, Nikita. Sergey K is now going to take us through the changes to the transaction author agreement.
Okay, I'll share my screen now. Hopefully you can see it and hear me.
Yeah, it looks good. Sounds good.
Okay, well, recently we had an update to requirements of transaction author agreement. It was done in scope of Indy 2302 and 2313 tickets. Now implementation is almost in place, and we are finishing documenting it. So main changes are the following. First of all, it is possible to have multiple transaction author agreements on the network. Probably this is the most important change, which and all other changes are made to support this. Also, now every transaction author agreement should consist not only of version and tiers, but also a defined ratification date, which can be different from time when transaction author agreement was posted to the network. This is done in order to publish agreement somewhere in advance, make people accept it in advance, and at the time when it is really enforced on the ledger, they could use the acceptance date, which was a bit, which could be in the past relative to moment when this TA was posted on ledger. Another feature, another very important feature is that now it is possible to set a retirement date for transaction author agreements. There are some constraints here. One of them is that this retirement date cannot be set to latest transaction author agreement, and also when posting a new transaction author agreement to the network, we cannot, obviously we cannot set retirement date to it as well, because it will be the latest transaction author agreement. Retirement date would be used in order to smoothly transition from one transaction author agreement version to another. And one of the reasons why we shouldn't allow retiring latest transactional author agreements is that it's a safeguard, so we don't accidentally put a retirement date on latest or the only available transaction author agreement, and it silently disappears from the pool. If we need to disable all transaction author agreements, we now have a separate transaction for this, so we don't accidentally leave pool without transaction author agreement enforcement. All those changes are reflected in documentation. As you can see, there is quite a number of changes. Documentation is located both in Plenum, in the Plenum repository, and in Indy Node. For example, oh, sorry, something did happen. So the format of updated transaction author agreement is also documented. These these pairs are going to be merged after a short review. That's all from me. Any questions?
It's really useful. So people understand, when I originally thought about how the transactional agreement work in practice, I was thinking in terms of an individual using the Indy command line interface to write to the ledger, and it returns and says, hey, this ledger has an agreement you need to agree to. So you scroll through and you agree to it. And that scenario works fine. But what we find is that a lot of organizations, when they're writing to the ledger, most ledger rights are organizational rights because we don't want personal data on the ledger. Those organizations, the person typing isn't the one empowered to accept the agreement on behalf of the organization. That agreement has to be accepted by legal. It has to go through legal review. And so there's a few other styles of acceptance that include my organization has it on file, or I accept it as part of my service provider agreement when that went through legal review. And when that happens, that can actually predate things away on the ledger. The transaction author agreement was ratified by the Sovereign Governance Framework Working Group in early December 2019, but it's not going to be on the ledger till mid-January. And so we need to make sure that people can accept before it's actually on the ledger. And then once they've accepted, that correctly gets sent. And then when the transition happens and we have a new agreement, we need to make sure that transition's smooth, that the agreement goes on the ledger as soon as possible so I can use it as soon as my legal review's done, but it's not enforced. I can still use the old agreement during that transition period. But that eventually a retirement date comes and the old one does stop being useful and I have to use the new one to proceed, so the stewards are protected. So that's the change that we made. I think does a pretty good job at meeting those needs. Now, the transaction auth agreement does contain a little difference compared to what we thought as well when we designed the functionality. The lawyers said, hey, this can be like any other privacy policy that we can say in the agreement, if you continue to use this agreement, then you've accepted the latest version. So we used to recommend that and there's a blog post of the Sovrin Foundation that recommends that every time the agreement changes, we need to tell the user this has changed, and give them the full text for them to review that. According to legal advice we're getting now, that's not required. We just need to tell the user this has changed. We don't have to display all the text for them to scroll through. We just have to notify them. And then we can give them the updated hash and the updated acceptance date when they accepted the latest version of the agreement. So that should make for easier user experiences. We need to update the blog post about that. I'll work with the Sovrin Foundation. One other change we noticed is some people are using this, they realize, hey, we don't have the hash. How do we validate that we're using the exact hash that's on the ledger? And the answer to that is we should be including that hash, the digest, in the transaction auth agreement response. We'd missed that, so that's fixed in this version as well. So that'll go on the ledger, on the Sovrin ledger in January. So thank you, Sergey, for taking us through that. The updated documentation is going to be really handy. I will link to that in the show notes on the video description on YouTube. And if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out to us on Rocket Chat. Chat.sovrin.org is probably the best place to talk about the Sovrin specific transaction auth agreement. With that, I'll share my screen and we'll look really quickly at the next couple of sprints, or the next sprint, I should say. So on the SDK side, we're mostly, we do need to finish up some of the libvcx areas interoperability stuff, but we also, there are a number of bugs that we want to make sure we tick off, and then we're going to get a release out before the end of the year. Oh, I should say, it is the end of the year. That means we're all going to enjoy a break. So this sprint is going to go 4 weeks. Expect the next sprint demo to be mid-January, and we're all going to take at least a week off, hopefully more, and enjoy end of the year holidays. So I'm excited about that. The team's worked hard, and it's going to be good for everybody to unplug for a little while. So we do expect to get a release out before the end of December. The Russia team's taking Christmas a bit different than here in the States, so they'll be able to get that release out. Christmas present to the Western the Western Hemisphere, and it should have these bug fixes. I don't know if it'll be exactly these bug fixes. We'll see how many we get through, but it'll have a number of bug fixes and some additional improvements to libvcx for areas interoperability. On the Node side, similarly, we want to get a release out before the end of the year, before the New Year's holiday, and that's going to include the finishing up the changes to the transaction auth agreement, and then we'll get through as many bugs as we can between now and then. We still have not. I think we're going to be able to remove the replicas in January for the January release, but we're still finalizing that plan. So, but we've got a number of stability fixes and performance fixes we want to get done as well. So we'll get as many of those into the December release as we can, and then we'll cut that release, go on a break, and come back and record a video about it in the second week of January. So that's the current plan. Did I miss anything? Team saying I did okay. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Again, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us. We hang out at chat.hyperledger.org in the Indy channel, also in the Aries channels. There's the Aries channels are fairly high traffic, so I do pretty good at staying up on the Indy ones, but the Aries ones I dip in and out. We also hang out a lot on the chat.sovrin.org in the various channels there, so you can find us. And with that, I wish everybody a enjoyable end of the year holiday, and hopefully everybody gets a break, and we look forward to, we'll post another video in the second week of January.